Captain James Mitchell had served the British royal family for 15 years. His polished boots clicked against the marble floors of Kensington Palace as he made his morning rounds. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. He had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royals, and there was no honor greater than being assigned to guard young Prince George. At 38 years old, James was known throughout the palace for his unwavering loyalty and sharp instincts. His colleagues respected him, and the royal staff trusted him completely. He had witnessed countless private moments of the royal family, always maintaining the strict code of silence that came with his position. Nothing he saw or heard ever left the palace walls. Prince George, now 11 years old, had grown up under James's watchful eye. The captain had seen the young prince take his first steps in the palace gardens, watched him learn to ride horses, and observed his progression through his early education. George was a bright child, curious about the world around him, but sometimes struggled with the weight of his future responsibilities. The palace operated like a well-oiled machine. Every day followed a precise schedule. James would arrive at dawn, review security reports, and coordinate with other guards. His primary duty was ensuring Prince George's safety during all activities, whether it was attending formal events, going to school, or simply playing in the palace grounds. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, something felt different. James noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere around the palace. Staff members seemed more tense than usual, whispering in corners and avoiding eye contact. Even the normally cheerful kitchen staff appeared subdued as they prepared the morning meals. James had learned to trust his instincts over the years. They had saved him and others countless times during his military service before joining the Royal Protection Unit. That morning, his instincts were telling him something was wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. As he prepared for Prince George's daily schedule, James reviewed the security arrangements one more time. The young prince was expected to attend a private tutoring session in the morning, followed by lunch with his grandmother, and then an afternoon of supervised play in the palace gardens. Everything seemed routine on paper. The tutoring session took place in the East Wing Library, a magnificent room filled with ancient books and comfortable reading chairs. James positioned himself outside the heavy oak doors. As was protocol, he could hear the muffled voices of Prince George and his tutor, discussing mathematics and history. During the lesson, James noticed something unusual. One of the senior palace advisors, Lord Pemberton, walked past the library 3 times within an hour. This was highly irregular, as Lord Pemberton rarely ventured to the educational wing of the palace. Each time he passed, he glanced nervously at the library doors and exchanged brief words with other staff members. James's training had taught him to observe everything and question anything out of the ordinary. He made mental notes of each person who passed by and their behavior. His job wasn't just about physical protection, it was about being aware of potential threats from all angles. When the tutoring session ended, Prince George emerged from the library with his usual enthusiasm. He was carrying a small notebook where he had been practicing his handwriting. The young prince always enjoyed showing James his academic progress, and today was no different. "Captain Mitchell, look what I learned today," Prince George said excitedly, holding up his notebook. "My tutor taught me how to write formal letters. She said it's important for someone in my position to communicate properly." James smiled warmly at the prince's enthusiasm. "That's excellent, Your Highness. Good communication skills will serve you well throughout your life." As they walked toward the dining room for lunch, James noticed more unusual activity. Several staff members were clustered around the main staircase, engaged in hushed conversations. When they saw James and Prince George approaching, they quickly dispersed and pretended to be busy with their normal duties. The lunch with the Queen Mother was scheduled to take place in the smaller, more intimate dining room rather than the grand dining hall. This room was Prince George's favorite because it overlooked the palace gardens where he loved to play. The walls were decorated with portraits of previous monarchs, and the atmosphere was always warm and welcoming. James positioned himself near the entrance, maintaining visual contact with Prince George while allowing the family their privacy during the meal. Through the partially open door, he could see the Queen Mother and Prince George engaged in animated conversation. The elderly woman clearly adored her great-grandson and always made time for these special lunches. However, James couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was developing behind the scenes. The unusual behavior of the staff, the nervous energy in the palace, and Lord Pemberton's repeated appearances all suggested that something important was happening that he wasn't aware of. His phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor, requesting a meeting immediately after Prince George's lunch. The message was brief and gave no indication of the purpose. But James sensed it might be related to the strange atmosphere he had been observing throughout the morning. As lunch concluded, Prince George hugged his great-grandmother goodbye and prepared for the afternoon activities. James escorted him to the gardens, where they would spend some time outdoors before the evening's formal dinner. The palace gardens were extensive and beautiful, with carefully maintained flower beds, ancient trees, and secluded pathways. Prince George loved these outdoor sessions. Away from the formal atmosphere of the palace interior, he could be more like a normal child. He enjoyed exploring different areas of the gardens, observing wildlife, and asking James endless questions about nature, history, and life beyond the palace walls. "Captain Mitchell," Prince George said as they walked along a gravel path lined with rose bushes, "do you think being royal is more of a privilege or a responsibility?" The question caught James off guard. It was unusually mature for an 11-year-old, and it suggested that Prince George was beginning to understand the complexity of his future role. James considered his response carefully, wanting to be honest while remaining appropriate. "I believe it's both, Your Highness," James replied thoughtfully. "Great privilege comes with great responsibility. The key is finding balance, and always remembering that your position exists to serve others." Prince George nodded seriously, seeming to absorb this wisdom. James had always been impressed by the young prince's intelligence and thoughtfulness. Despite his privileged upbringing, George showed genuine curiosity about the world and concern for others. As they continued their walk, James's radio crackled with updates from other security personnel around the palace. Everything seemed normal from a security standpoint, but James couldn't ignore the underlying tension he felt throughout the complex. The afternoon was drawing to a close when James received another message from his supervisor, this time marking it as urgent. He was instructed to report to the security office immediately after ensuring Prince George was safely delivered to his evening tutors. As they headed back toward the palace, James found himself studying Prince George more carefully than usual. The young prince seemed perfectly normal, chatting about his lessons and asking questions about James's military background. There was nothing in George's behavior to suggest anything unusual was happening, yet James couldn't escape the feeling that this day would somehow be significant in ways he couldn't yet understand. His years of experience had taught him to trust these instincts, even when logic suggested everything was fine. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as they approached the main entrance. James prepared to hand over his charge to the evening security detail, unaware that the events of the next few hours would challenge everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the true meaning of service to the crown. The security office was located in the basement of Kensington Palace. Away from the public areas and formal rooms, James had been summoned there countless times over his 15-year career, but tonight felt different. The corridor leading to the office seemed longer than usual, and his footsteps echoed ominously against the stone walls. Chief Security Officer Margaret Thornton was waiting for him with a grim expression. She was a woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the ranks of Royal Protection Services. James respected her greatly, and seeing her worried face immediately put him on high alert. "James, please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "What I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential, even more so than our usual protocols." James sat down, his military posture automatic, even in this informal setting. "Of course, ma'am. What's the situation?" Margaret shuffled through several documents on her desk before looking directly at him. "We've been conducting a routine review of palace security footage from the past several weeks. During this review, we discovered something that has caused considerable concern among senior palace officials." She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. James waited patiently, though his mind was racing with possibilities. Security footage reviews were standard procedure, but they rarely resulted in urgent meetings unless something serious had been found. The footage shows Prince George engaged in activities that were not part of his official schedule, Margaret continued. On multiple occasions over the past month, he has been leaving his designated areas during periods when he was supposed to be in supervised study or rest. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. As Prince George's primary guard, any unauthorized movement by the young prince was ultimately his responsibility. I'm not sure I understand, ma'am. Prince George has been with me or other authorized personnel during all scheduled activities. Margaret turned her computer monitor toward James and began playing a video file. The black and white security footage showed a corridor in the east wing of the palace. The timestamp indicated it was taken 3 weeks earlier, during what should have been Prince George's afternoon rest period. On the screen, James watched as a small figure crept carefully down the corridor, staying close to the walls and moving with surprising stealth for an 11-year-old. It was unmistakably Prince George, but he was alone and clearly trying to avoid detection. This footage was taken during a time when Prince George was officially scheduled to be reading in his private chambers, Margaret explained. According to our logs, he was under the supervision of his afternoon tutor. James watched in disbelief as the footage continued. Prince George moved through several corridors before entering a part of the palace that was rarely used by the royal family. This section housed mainly administrative offices and storage areas for historical artifacts. How is this possible? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The tutoring sessions are supervised, and I personally escort Prince George to and from his chambers. Margaret played another video file, this one from a different day. Again, it showed Prince George moving through the palace alone, but this time, he was carrying what appeared to be a small bag or satchel. The young prince moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the route he was taking. We've identified at least 7 separate incidents over the past month, Margaret said. Each time, Prince George managed to leave his supervised location without anyone noticing, and spent approximately 30 to 45 minutes in areas where he had no official business. James felt a mixture of confusion and concern. How had Prince George managed to evade not just his tutors, but also the various security cameras and staff members throughout the palace? More importantly, what was he doing during these unauthorized excursions? Have we determined what he was doing in these areas? James asked, studying the footage more carefully. Margaret's expression grew even more serious. That's where this situation becomes particularly concerning. The areas Prince George was visiting house some of the palace's most sensitive historical documents and artifacts. These items are not typically accessible to anyone without special authorization, including members of the royal family. She showed James additional footage that revealed Prince George entering rooms that contained centuries-old documents, royal correspondence, and artifacts that were part of the crown's private collection. These weren't tourist attractions or display pieces, but actual working documents and items of immense historical and political significance. We've conducted a preliminary inventory of these rooms, Margaret continued, and while nothing appears to be missing, there are signs that various documents and items have been handled recently. Dust patterns suggest that several filing cabinets and storage boxes have been opened and examined. James tried to process this information. The idea that Prince George was conducting some kind of unauthorized research into historical royal documents seemed almost impossible to believe, yet the evidence was right there on the security footage. Has anyone spoken to Prince George about this yet? James asked. That's why you're here, Margaret replied. Given your close relationship with the prince and his obvious trust in you, senior palace officials have decided that you should be the one to investigate this matter further before it's escalated to his parents or other family members. The weight of this responsibility settled heavily on James's shoulders. He was being asked to essentially spy on the child he had sworn to protect. It went against every instinct he had developed over his years of service. What exactly do they want me to do? He asked carefully. Margaret handed him a sealed envelope. Your assignment is to monitor Prince George more closely during his scheduled activities and determine how he's managing to leave supervised areas undetected. You're also tasked with discovering what specific documents or artifacts he's been accessing and why. James took the envelope, feeling like he was crossing some invisible line. And if I discover that Prince George is engaged in something that could be considered inappropriate or dangerous, then we'll address that situation when we reach it, Margaret said firmly. For now, the priority is understanding what's happening and why. The royal family's reputation and security could be at stake, depending on what Prince George has discovered or what he's planning to do with any information he's obtained. As James left the security office, his mind was spinning with questions and concerns. He had always prided himself on his ability to protect and serve the royal family with absolute loyalty. Now he was being asked to investigate one of the very people he had sworn to protect. The next morning arrived with unusual tension. James prepared for his duties as always, but now he was viewing everything through a different lens. When he arrived at Prince George's chambers to begin the daily routine, he found himself studying the young prince's behavior for any signs of deception or unusual planning. Prince George greeted him with his typical enthusiasm, chatting about his plans for the day and asking questions about James's military experiences. To any casual observer, the prince seemed perfectly normal, but James now knew to look for subtle signs of secretive behavior. During the morning tutoring session, James positioned himself where he could observe both the library entrance and the corridor leading to the east wing. He paid closer attention to the timing of the session and the exact locations where Prince George claimed to be at various times. About halfway through the tutoring session, James noticed something he had previously overlooked. When the tutor briefly left the room to retrieve additional materials, there was a 3-minute gap during which Prince George was supposedly alone in the library. James realized that this brief window could potentially provide enough time for a quick exit and return if someone knew exactly where they were going. When the tutor returned, Prince George was seated exactly where he had been left, working diligently on his assignments. But James noticed that the prince seemed slightly more alert than usual, as if he were listening for something or monitoring the activity in the corridor outside. During lunch with the Queen Mother, James observed Prince George's behavior even more carefully. The young prince was charming and attentive as always, but James detected moments when George's attention seemed to drift, as if his mind were occupied with other matters. The afternoon garden session provided James with an opportunity to probe more directly. As they walked through the grounds, he decided to test Prince George's reactions to questions about the palace's history and architecture. "Your Highness," James said casually, "I've always been curious about some of the older sections of the palace. Do you ever explore areas beyond your usual routes?" Prince George's response was immediate, and perhaps a bit too quick. "Oh, not really. The palace is quite large, and I mostly stick to the areas I know well." "Why do you ask?" Again, James detected a slight tension in the prince's voice, and the fact that George had immediately asked a counter-question suggested he might be deflecting. "I was just thinking about how much history these walls have witnessed. There must be fascinating artifacts and documents stored throughout the building." "I suppose there are," Prince George replied, but his tone had become more guarded. "Though I imagine most of the really important historical items are kept in special collections that require authorization to access." The conversation continued, but James noticed that Prince George seemed less relaxed for the remainder of their walk. The young prince's body language suggested he was now more aware of James's questions and possibly concerned about where they might lead. That evening, James filed his first report with Margaret Thornton. He documented the subtle behavioral changes he had observed, and his growing suspicion that Prince George was indeed engaged in some kind of secretive activity. However, he still had no concrete evidence of how the prince was managing his unauthorized excursions or what he hoped to accomplish. As James prepared for another day of investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that would fundamentally change his relationship with Prince George and possibly his entire career in royal service. The young prince was clearly more resourceful and determined than anyone had realized, and James was beginning to suspect that whatever George was doing, it was driven by something much more significant than simple childhood curiosity. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon, when James decided to take a calculated risk. Instead of positioning himself in his usual location during Prince George's tutoring session, he concealed himself in an alcove that provided a clear view of both the library entrance and the corridor leading to the restricted areas of the palace. His patience was rewarded 20 minutes into the session when he observed something remarkable. Prince George quietly opened the library door and peered carefully down the corridor. After confirming that no one was visible, the young prince slipped out of the room and moved swiftly but silently toward the east wing. James followed at a distance, using his military training to remain undetected while keeping Prince George in sight. He watched as the prince navigated through several corridors with obvious familiarity, taking a route that avoided the main security checkpoints and areas with heavy staff traffic. Prince George stopped at a door marked, "Historical Archives, Authorized Personnel Only." To James's amazement, the young prince produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. James positioned himself where he could observe through a partially open window that provided a view into the archive room. What he saw inside completely changed his understanding of the situation. Prince George wasn't randomly exploring or playing games. He was engaged in serious research, carefully examining historical documents and making notes in a small journal. But more surprisingly, he wasn't alone. Sitting at a table in the archive room was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who had worked in the palace's historical research department for over 40 years. She was a quiet, unassuming person whom James had seen occasionally but had never spoken to at length. Mrs. Hartwell was helping Prince George examine what appeared to be very old documents and photographs. James watched as Prince George and Mrs. Hartwell worked together, the elderly woman pointing out specific details in the historical materials, while the young prince took careful notes. Their interaction was clearly that of a student and teacher, but this was happening completely outside the official palace educational structure. After observing for several minutes, James made a decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. Instead of reporting immediately to his supervisors, he chose to confront Prince George and Mrs. Hartwell directly. He knocked gently on the archive room door. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Hartwell, who looked startled but not entirely surprised to see James. "Captain Mitchell," she said quietly, "I suppose you were bound to discover us eventually." Prince George appeared behind her, his face showing a mixture of fear and resignation. "Captain Mitchell, please let me explain before you report this to anyone." James entered the archive room and closed the door behind him. "I think you'd better tell me exactly what's going on here, Your Highness. And Mrs. Hartwell, I'd like to understand how you're involved in this situation." Mrs. Hartwell gestured for James to sit down. "Captain Mitchell, what you've discovered here isn't what it might appear to be. Prince George approached me several weeks ago with a request that initially surprised me, but which I've come to understand represents something quite extraordinary." Prince George looked directly at James, his young face showing a maturity that seemed beyond his 11 years. "Captain Mitchell, I've been researching the history of royal guards and palace staff who have served our family over the centuries. Not the famous ones that everyone knows about, but the ordinary people whose names were never recorded in official histories." James was confused. "I don't understand, Your Highness. Why would this require secret meetings and unauthorized access to restricted documents?" Mrs. Hartwell spread several documents across the table. "Captain Mitchell, these are personnel records, letters, and testimonials dating back over 200 years. They document the service and sacrifices of guards, servants, cooks, groundskeepers, and countless others who dedicated their lives to serving the royal family." Prince George picked up his notebook, which was filled with handwritten entries. "I started wondering about all the people like you, Captain Mitchell, who spend their entire careers protecting and serving our family. I wanted to know their stories, their names, their families. I wanted to understand what their service meant to them, and what happened to them after their years of service ended." James felt something shift inside his chest as he began to understand what he was witnessing. "Your Highness, why was this research so important to you that you were willing to risk getting into serious trouble?" Prince George's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "Because I realized that I'm going to spend my entire life being served by people like you, Captain Mitchell. People who will sacrifice their time, their families, their own dreams to take care of me and protect me. But I don't know anything about them as real people." Mrs. Hartwell added, "Prince George discovered that, while we have extensive records of royal activities and ceremonies, we have very little documentation of the personal lives and experiences of the staff who made those events possible. He wanted to change that." James looked at the documents spread across the table. He could see lists of names, employment records, and what appeared to be personal letters from staff members to their families. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this research?" Prince George wiped his eyes and opened his notebook to a specific page. "I'm creating a memorial record, Captain Mitchell. A place where the names and stories of all the people who have served our family will be preserved and honored. Not just their job titles, but who they were as people. He showed James several pages filled with carefully written entries. Each entry contained a name, dates of service, family information when available, and notes about the person's contributions to the royal household. Some entries included details about staff members' children, their interests outside of work, and their circumstances after leaving royal service. Mrs. Hartwell has been helping me understand the historical context and locate documents that mention staff members' personal lives. Prince George continued. We found letters from guards writing to their wives, records of Christmas bonuses given to help servants with family emergencies, and testimonials written by departing staff about their experiences. James felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he was learning. Your Highness, this is incredibly thoughtful. But why the secrecy? Why not pursue this research through official channels? Mrs. Hartwell answered, because official palace protocols would require approval from multiple departments, and there was concern that such a project might be seen as inappropriate or unnecessary. The royal family's focus is typically on official duties and public service, not on documenting the lives of individual staff members. Prince George nodded. I knew that if I asked for permission, adults would find reasons why this wasn't a good use of my time. They would say I should focus on my regular studies and official responsibilities. But Captain Mitchell, how can I learn to be a good future king if I don't understand the real people who make the monarchy possible? James sat in silence for several moments, processing everything he had learned. The young prince had been conducting secret research not for personal gain or childish curiosity, but out of a genuine desire to honor and understand the people who served his family. This level of empathy and social consciousness in an 11-year-old was extraordinary. Your Highness, James finally said, what you're doing here is remarkable. But you must understand that your unauthorized access to restricted areas has caused serious concern among security personnel. My supervisors are waiting for my report on your activities. Prince George's face fell. I understand, Captain Mitchell. I know I broke rules, and I'm prepared to accept the consequences. But I hope someday this research can continue, even if I'm not allowed to participate directly. Mrs. Hartwell looked at James pleadingly. Captain Mitchell, in my 40 years of service to this family, I have never encountered a young royal who showed such genuine interest in understanding and honoring the people who serve them. What Prince George is doing represents the very best values of royal service. James found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what true service meant. He could file his report exactly as his supervisors expected, documenting Prince George's rule violations and ending this remarkable research project. Or he could take a stand based on what he now understood about the prince's character and motivations. Your Highness, James said slowly, what you've shown me today has taught me more about leadership and compassion than 15 years of formal royal protocol. The fact that you would risk punishment to honor people like me tells me everything I need to know about the kind of king you will someday become. Prince George looked up hopefully. Does this mean you won't report our activities? James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where he had spent so many years protecting this family. When he turned back to face Prince George and Mrs. Hartwell, his decision was clear. I will be submitting my resignation from royal service effective immediately, he said quietly. Not because I'm disappointed in you, Your Highness, but because I realize that my role as your protector should include protecting your character and your conscience, even when that means standing up to the system that employs me. Mrs. Hartwell gasped. Captain Mitchell, surely that's not necessary. Prince George stood up, tears streaming down his face. Captain Mitchell, please don't leave because of what I did. I'll accept whatever punishment they give me, but please don't sacrifice your career for my mistakes. James knelt down so he was at eye level with Prince George. Your Highness, what you've done here isn't a mistake. It's one of the most honorable things I've ever witnessed, and I'm not sacrificing my career. I'm honoring it by making sure that your research and your respect for others is protected and encouraged. He stood up and addressed both Prince George and Mrs. Hartwell. I'm going to recommend that this research project be officially recognized and supported by the palace administration. And if they refuse, Then I'll know that I've served my purpose here, and it's time for me to find other ways to honor the values you've shown me today." Prince George hugged James tightly. "Thank you for understanding, Captain Mitchell. Thank you for seeing what I was really trying to do." As James walked toward the security office to submit his resignation and his final report, he felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. He had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of service is knowing when to step away from the system in order to protect the principles that system should represent. His resignation letter would become legendary within royal service circles, not for its criticism of palace protocols, but for its celebration of a young prince who understood that true leadership begins with honoring those who serve others. James Mitchell had found his own way to serve the crown by protecting the heart and conscience of the future king.